The airplane speaker crackled to life with that familiar pre-landing static, then fell silent. No announcement came. Outside the terminal windows at Denver International Airport, fire trucks lined the taxiway like sentinels, their lights painting the afternoon sky in urgent reds and whites. Ambulances idled behind them, doors open, paramedics clustered in tight formations, waiting for what nobody wanted to name aloud. Flight 447 sat motionless on the tarmac 200 yards away, emergency slides deployed and rippling in the Colorado wind. Passengers stumbled down the inflated chutes, some crying, others frozen in that peculiar stillness that follows near death. News helicopters circled overhead like carrion birds, their rotors chopping the air into frantic rhythms. Near the rear landing gear, a woman sat on the concrete in a wrinkled Armani suit that had cost more than most people earned in a month. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in dark rivulets. Her hands trembled as FBI agents in windbreakers surrounded her, their badges catching the sunlight. One agent spoke into his radio while another produced zip-tie restraints from his belt. Victoria Hale, CEO of Aerotech Solutions, didn't resist as they secured her wrists. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Shock, probably, or the dawning understanding that everything she'd built over 15 years had just collapsed in the span of 90 minutes. 20 feet away, a man in a faded leather flight jacket walked toward the terminal building. His shoulders carried the weight of 41 years with an ease that suggested military discipline never quite left the body. On the back of his jacket, gold thread spelled out a call sign most civilians wouldn't recognize: Echo 9. Beneath it, the patch of the 104th Fighter Squadron, an F-22 Raptor streaking through storm clouds. Darius Mitchell didn't look back at the woman being taken into custody. His face remained impassive, carved from something harder than the circumstances required. Someone had saved 204 lives today, but his expression suggested he'd simply shown up for another shift. The news chyron at the bottom of CNN's live feed told the story in block letters. Hero pilot saves 204 lives after software failure. CO in FBI custody. 3 hours earlier, none of this existed yet. Just the ordinary morning routines of people who thought they understood how their Tuesday would unfold. The alarm clock in Darius Mitchell's apartment buzzed at 5:47, 3 minutes earlier than necessary, but late enough that his daughter wouldn't wake. He silenced it with the practiced motion of someone who'd been waking before dawn for 2 decades. The bedroom was small, barely large enough for the queen mattress and the dresser he'd bought at a thrift store in Aurora. No artwork on the walls, just a photograph in a simple black frame. A younger version of himself in dress blues standing beside a woman whose smile could have lit up the whole state of Colorado. Keisha Mitchell had been gone 8 years now. Childbirth complications, the doctor said, were preventable, which made it worse somehow. Left him with a daughter named Amara and a grief that had settled into his bones like Colorado winter. He touched the frame once, a daily ritual, then moved to the bathroom. The shower ran cold for the first 30 seconds. He didn't mind. Cold water kept you sharp, kept you present. While the steam finally rose, he ran through the mental checklist he'd carried since his Air Force days. Today's objective? Nevada. Mission parameters: attend the 6th annual memorial service for Captain Marcus Washington. Personal effects required: dress uniform, folded flag, Marcus's aviator watch. The watch sat on the bathroom counter now, its leather band worn smooth from years of wear. Darius had stopped wearing his own timepiece 3 years ago when he retired from active duty. Marcus's watch kept better time anyway, and it reminded him of something his wingman used to say during their deployments. Time's just another instrument, Rowan. You don't watch it, you feel it. Marcus had been the kind of pilot who could sense wind shear before the instruments registered it, who knew when to trust his gut over the computer readouts. 6 years ago, during a routine training exercise over the Nevada desert, that instinct had saved 3 pilots and cost Marcus everything. Mid-air collision. 2 F-22s, rookie pilots both, converging on the same coordinates. Marcus had seen it developing, had put his aircraft between them, and absorbed the impact. The other pilots walked away. Marcus's ejection seat malfunctioned. They found his plane scattered across 40 square miles of scrubland. Darius had been on the ground that day, recently transferred to instructor duty after his 100th combat sortie. He'd listened to the radio traffic, heard Marcus's last transmission. Calm, clear, professional, even as his fighter disintegrated around him. Echo 9. You tell Elena I love her. Tell my baby girl her daddy loved the sky, but he loved them more. Then static. The shower turned cold again, but Darius didn't notice. He stood under the spray, eyes closed, remembering. By 6:15 he had breakfast started. Nothing fancy, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice poured into 2 glasses. Amara shuffled into the kitchen wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with astronauts floating across purple fabric. At 8 years old, she already had her mother's smile and her father's serious eyes. Morning, baby girl. She climbed into her chair, still half asleep. You're leaving today? Not a question. Amara understood his schedule better than most adults manage their own calendars. Just for the day. Mrs. Williams will pick you up from school. I'll be back tomorrow night. For Uncle Marcus? That's right. She picked at her eggs, quiet for a moment. Then she slid a folded piece of construction paper across the table. I made you something. Darius opened it carefully. Crayon drawing. A man in a flight suit standing next to an airplane. Above his head, wobbly letters spelled out, Be brave, Daddy, like Uncle Marcus taught you. His throat tightened. This is perfect, sweetheart. Thank you. Mrs. Williams says Uncle Marcus is in heaven watching over us. Mrs. Williams is a wise woman. Do you think he's proud of you? Darius looked at his daughter, at the earnest hope in her face, and felt the familiar weight of trying to be enough. Enough parent, enough provider, enough memory of the woman who should have been here raising this child with him. I hope so, baby. I try to live the way he taught me. After breakfast, after making sure Amara had her backpack and her lunch and her homework folder, Darius returned to his bedroom and pulled the duffel bag from the closet. The American flag inside had been folded with precision at Marcus's funeral. 21-gun salute, taps played by a bugler who'd probably performed the same duty 1,000 times. Beneath the flag, his dress uniform, the ribbons and medals arranged exactly as regulations specified. The Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. All of them felt hollow now. Pieces of metal that couldn't bring back the people they were supposed to honor. He packed the uniform carefully, added the flag, clipped Marcus's watch to the outside pocket where he could see it. Then he grabbed his civilian clothes for the flight, faded jeans, a navy hoodie with the F-22 squadron patch barely visible on the sleeve, worn running shoes that had logged more miles than his Honda Civic. The Civic sat in the apartment complex parking lot looking exactly as old as its registration suggested. A 1998 model with 247,000 miles on the odometer and a passenger door that didn't quite match the rest of the paint job. Darius had bought it for $1,800 5 years ago. It ran fine, got decent mileage, and didn't attract attention. Everything he needed. He drove Amara to school, watched her skip toward the entrance with her backpack bouncing, then pointed the Civic toward Denver International Airport. Traffic was light at 7:30 on a Tuesday. He made it to the economy parking lot by 8:15, shouldered his duffel, and walked into the terminal. Gate 27 sat at the far end of Concourse B. Darius found a seat near the windows, away from the crowd clustered around the departure screens. He pulled out the letter Marcus had written before that final training flight. Not a premonition, just standard procedure for pilots with families. In case something happens, here's what you need to know. The paper had softened from repeated handling over 6 years. Darius didn't need to read the words anymore. He had them memorized. But holding the letter connected him to something larger than the hourly wage he earned fixing aircraft. larger than the modest apartment and the used car and the constant calculation of whether he could afford new shoes for a daughter growing faster than his budget allowed. "Elena needs someone who understands," Marcus had written. "Someone who knows what we do up there isn't about glory. It's about coming home. Make sure my girls know I tried to come home." Darius had kept that promise, visited Elena and her daughter every few months, helped with repairs around their house, showed up for birthdays and graduations, did what Marcus would have done if their positions had been reversed. Across the gate area, a commotion drew his attention. A woman in a tailored suit the color of fresh snow strode through the concourse like she owned the air itself. Diamond earrings caught the fluorescent light, the kind of stones that cost more than Darius earned in 6 months. Her heels clicked against the tile with percussive authority. Behind her, a younger woman struggled with a leather carry-on, a laptop bag, and a designer purse that probably weighed more than all 3 items combined. The woman in white stopped at the gate counter, not waiting for the line of passengers ahead of her. "I need to speak with the gate agent. Now." The current passenger, an elderly man trying to explain his special meal request, turned to look at her. She didn't acknowledge him. The gate agent, a woman in her 30s with Southwest Airlines embroidered on her vest, held up one finger. "I'll be with you in just a moment, ma'am." "You'll be with me now. Do you understand how airline hierarchy works? I'm not standing in line with—" She gestured vaguely at the other passengers. "Them." The elderly man shuffled aside, apologetic. The woman in white stepped forward and placed a platinum credit card on the counter with the deliberate precision of someone playing a winning hand. "Victoria Hale, CEO of Aerotech Solutions. I assume you're aware that my company provides the flight management software for this airline's entire fleet?" The gate agent's professional smile didn't waver. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" "First class is sold out. Apparently your system allowed an overbooking situation. I need you to find me a seat in first class, and I need you to upgrade my assistant as well." "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Hale, but we are completely full in first class today. Holiday travel and—" "I don't care about holiday travel. I care about sitting where I pay to sit, which is not in economy with people who barely understand how to operate a seatbelt." Her voice carried across the gate area. Several passengers looked up from their phones. The assistant behind Victoria, a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, shifted the bags in her arms and studied the floor. The gate agent typed something into her computer. "I can offer you a seat in Economy Plus. Extra legroom, priority boarding. Economy Plus is still economy. Do you understand what economy means? It means failure. It means settling for less. I don't settle." Darius watched this unfold with the detached interest of someone who'd seen similar displays before. Entitlement had a particular pitch, a frequency that grated against people who'd actually earned their confidence through competence rather than volume. The gate agent maintained her composure. "I understand your frustration, Miss Hale, but I don't have any first-class seats available. I've confirmed you in 14B, which is our Economy Plus section. You'll board with Group 1. Victoria's face tightened. "Fine, but you'll be hearing from your supervisor about this disaster of an experience." She snatched her boarding pass and turned away, nearly colliding with an elderly black woman struggling to lift her carry-on bag. The woman was 70 if she was a day, arms trembling with the effort of hoisting luggage that should have been checked. Darius stood without thinking about it, crossed the gate area in 4 strides. "Let me help you, ma'am." The woman looked up, relief flooding her features.
"Oh, bless you, son. These old arms aren't what they used to be."
He lifted the bag easily, 30 pounds at most, and moved it to where she indicated. "You traveling alone today?"
"Just visiting my grandson in Las Vegas."
"He's in the Army, stationed at Nellis. Are you military? I can always tell." "Air Force, ma'am. Retired 3 years ago." Her eyes found the faded squadron patch on his hoodie.
"My grandson would be honored to meet you.
He talks about the pilots at Nellis like they're superheroes. Darius smiled, the expression genuine for the first time that morning. Your grandson is the real hero, ma'am. Anyone who serves is. Behind them, Victoria's voice cut through the moment. Can we move? Some of us have schedules to keep. Conversations can happen literally anywhere except the middle of a boarding lane. The elderly woman's face fell. Darius touched her shoulder gently. Don't worry about it. You take your time. He moved aside, giving Victoria a clear path. She swept past without acknowledgement, trailing expensive perfume and irritation in equal measure. The assistant followed, mouthing a silent sorry to no one in particular. Boarding began 10 minutes later. Darius waited until his group was called, then joined the line with his duffel slung over one shoulder. The elderly woman, Mrs. Dorothy Williams, according to her conversation with the gate agent, boarded ahead of him. He watched her navigate the jetway slowly, mindful of her steps. Inside the aircraft, the familiar smell of recycled air and industrial carpet. Darius found row 14 and stopped. Seat 14A. Window. He stowed his duffel in the overhead bin, settled into a seat, and pulled out the photograph he'd been carrying. Amara at 6 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, holding a toy F-22 she'd begged for at the base exchange. The seat beside him was empty. For about 30 seconds. Victoria Hale appeared in the aisle, checked her boarding pass twice, and stared at 14B like it had personally offended her. She glanced at Darius, at his worn jeans and faded hoodie, and something like disgust flickered across her face. She didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge his existence beyond the inconvenience of having to share space with someone clearly beneath her tax bracket. She sat down stiffly, positioned her designer purse on her lap like a barricade, and pulled out her phone. Darius tucked Amara's photo back into his wallet and turned toward the window. The morning sun hit the wing at an angle that made the metal gleam. Beautiful machines, airplanes. Elegant solutions to the problem of gravity. He'd spent half his life learning to command them, bend them to his will through stick and rudder and throttle control. The other half he'd spent learning to let them go. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts. Victoria flagged her down with the imperious gesture of someone accustomed to immediate service. Excuse me, is there any possibility of moving me to a different seat? Perhaps something in a quieter section? The flight attendant glanced at Darius, then back to Victoria. Her name tag read Sarah Blake. I'm sorry, ma'am, we're completely full today. This is the only available seat. Victoria's jaw tightened. Of course it is. Sarah moved on. Victoria opened her laptop, a slim silver model that probably cost $3,000, and angled the screen just enough that Darius could see it if he chose to look. The display showed a PowerPoint presentation, Aerotech Q4 results, with graphs trending sharply upward. Revolutionizing aviation software, Victoria said to no one in particular. Taking control systems into the 21st century. The future of flight management. Darius said nothing. The plane began to taxi. Victoria continued her one-sided conversation with the universe. Of course, you wouldn't understand the technical complexity. It's very specialized work. What do you do for a living? He could have ignored her. Should have, probably. But something about her tone, the presumption, the casual cruelty, triggered a response before he could reconsider. Aircraft maintenance. Her smile widened. Not with warmth, with vindication. Right. Well, someone has to do the grunt work, I suppose. The actual flying, the sophisticated systems management, that's for people with advanced degrees. But keeping the tools clean? That's important too. Darius looked at her for the first time since she'd sat down. Really looked. Saw the expensive suit, the jewelry, the perfectly styled hair that probably required more maintenance than his entire wardrobe. Saw the insecurity underneath, the need to diminish others to inflate herself. Yes, ma'am. Keeping the tools clean is important. She turned back to her laptop, satisfied. The plane reached the runway, engines spooling up. Darius felt the familiar acceleration, the moment when physics took over and metal and fuel and thrust combined into flight. The nose lifted. The ground fell away. They were airborne. Victoria ordered champagne before the seatbelt sign turned off. When it arrived, she held the plastic flute aloft. To those who actually belong in the sky. She took a sip, looked at Darius. You know, flying used to mean something. Used to be exclusive, reserved for people with standards. Now anyone can buy a ticket and pretend they're part of something special. Across the aisle, a businessman in his 50s chuckled. Amen to that. Too many people flying these days who should just stay grounded. Victoria found an ally. Exactly! Thank you! It's about maintaining certain levels of quality. Some people are meant to be up here, she gestured around the cabin, and others should really stick to what they know. The businessman raised his own drink. Here's to keeping the riffraff in their place. They clinked plastic cups across the aisle. Darius watched clouds slide past the window and thought about Marcus, about the last conversation they'd had before that training flight, standing on the tarmac at Nellis with the Nevada sun beating down hard enough to melt asphalt. You know what separates good pilots from great ones? Marcus had asked. Stick skills? Humility. The plane doesn't care about your ego. Physics doesn't negotiate. The best pilots are the ones who understand they're just along for the ride, managing forces bigger than themselves. From the row behind them, a small voice. Excuse me, mister? Darius turned. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, with blonde curls and curious eyes, leaned forward between the seats. She clutched a toy airplane in both hands, a miniature fighter jet with details painted by someone who cared about accuracy. Were you ever a pilot? You have a plane on your jacket. His face softened. Once upon a time, sweetheart. Her eyes went wide. A real plane? Like a fighter jet? Like a fighter jet. Was it scary? Flying that fast? Sometimes, but mostly, it was beautiful. Victoria's voice sliced through the moment. Oh, how adorable! Everyone's a hero in their own fantasy world, aren't they? The girl's mother, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes, pulled her daughter back. Emma, honey, don't bother the man. She's no bother at all, ma'am, Darius said. Victoria addressed the mother directly. Some of us are trying to work. Perhaps you could keep your child entertained without involving strangers? The mother's face reddened. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... It's fine, Darius said quietly. To Emma, you keep that plane safe, okay? Looks like it's had some adventures. Emma nodded seriously, cradling her toy. The plane leveled off at 32,000 feet. Outside, the sky stretched infinite and blue. Inside, Victoria continued her performance for an audience of one businessman who probably shared her view that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who served them. 20 minutes into the flight, Emma dropped her toy. It rolled forward, bumped against Victoria's foot. The girl reached between the seats trying to retrieve it. Victoria snatched the plane up. This is a workspace for me. I don't have time for children's toys cluttering my area. She threw the plane down the aisle. It skittered across the floor, hit a seat leg in row 20, and came to rest underneath someone's feet. Emma's face crumpled. Tears welled up but didn't fall, like she was trying very hard to be brave. Her mother went rigid. What is wrong with you? Victoria didn't even look at her. What's wrong is that I paid for peace and quiet, and instead I'm surrounded by chaos. Darius unbuckled, stood, walked down the aisle past staring passengers, found the toy under a businessman's loafer, the same one who'd toasted to keeping the riffraff in their place. Picked it up. The nose cone was slightly bent, but otherwise intact. He returned to row 15, knelt in the aisle so he was eye level with Emma. "Here you go, sweetheart. Little banged up, but fighters always come home." She took the plane, hugged it to her chest.
Thank you.
"You're welcome." He stood, looked at Victoria. She was typing on her laptop, deliberately ignoring him. He could have said something, called her out, made a scene, but Marcus's voice echoed across 6 years. "Altitude doesn't make you better, Rowan. How you treat people at ground level does." "She's just a child, ma'am." Victoria finally looked up. "And you're just a maintenance worker. Don't lecture me about appropriate behavior." Darius returned to his seat without another word. Victoria called the flight attendant over, Sarah, the one who'd been checking seatbelts during boarding. "I want this man moved. He's harassing me." Sarah glanced at Darius, confusion evident. "Ma'am, he was helping a child retrieve her toy." "He's making me uncomfortable." "I'm CEO of Aerotech Solutions. We provide the flight management software that runs this airline's control systems. One phone call to your supervisor, and you'll be looking for new employment. Do you understand?" Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. I'll see what I can do." She moved away. Darius could see her conferring with another flight attendant near the galley, both of them glancing back at row 14. Victoria turned to him, triumphant. "Some people need to learn their place." Sarah returned, her expression apologetic. "Sir, would you be willing to move to another seat? We have space available in the back of the cabin." Darius looked at Sarah, saw the helplessness there. Not her fault. She was caught between a bully with institutional leverage and a passenger who'd done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong tax bracket. "It's fine. I'll move." "Sir, you don't have to." "It's fine." He grabbed his duffel from the overhead bin. "I prefer the quiet anyway." He walked to row 32, deep in economy where the seats were tighter and the engine noise louder. Found 32E, middle seat. Stowed his bag. Sat down between a college student wearing headphones and a businessman absorbed in spreadsheets. Victoria watched him go with a satisfied smile. The businessman across the aisle from her nodded approval. Good riddance. Darius settled into his new seat, pulled out Amara's photo again, and looked at his daughter's gap-toothed grin. She'd asked him once why he didn't fight back when people were mean. He'd told her that fighting wasn't always about swinging fists. Sometimes fighting meant holding your ground by refusing to become what they accused you of being. The plane flew on, cutting through Colorado airspace at 420 knots. Darius rested his head against the seat back, closed his eyes, and let the engine noise fade into white static. In 3 hours, he'd be in Nevada, standing at Marcus's memorial with Elena and a crowd of people who understood what service actually meant. For now, he existed in the liminal space between destinations, neither grounded nor arrived. Just another passenger on a Tuesday flight, unremarkable to everyone, except the little girl in row 15, who still held her slightly bent fighter jet, and the woman in row 14, who just made the worst mistake of her life without knowing it yet. 10 rows ahead, Victoria finished her champagne and ordered another. The businessman across from her was explaining his portfolio strategy, and she listened with half her attention while composing an email on her phone about the disastrous boarding experience. This would make a good anecdote at the next board meeting, the indignities successful people endured while flying commercial. She didn't notice when the plane shuddered slightly at 11:15, a brief vibration that could have been turbulence. Didn't register when Darius sat up straighter in row 32, his eyes focusing on the window, watching the wing flap with the intensity of someone reading a language most passengers didn't speak. Didn't understand that the software her company had forced into production 6 days ago, over the objections of 3 senior engineers and a safety review board, was beginning to fail in exactly the way those engineers had predicted. In Seattle, in an Aerotech engineering lab, a man named Robert Patterson stared at his monitor and felt his stomach drop. 3 aircraft showing the same anomaly: hydraulic pressure fluctuations in the primary system, backup engaging prematurely, tertiary showing stress indicators it shouldn't reach for another 5,000 flight hours. He picked up his phone and dialed Victoria's number. Voicemail. Of course. She was in flight. Victoria, it's Rob. Emergency. The Flight Master 7.2 update is showing critical integration issues. We're seeing cascading hydraulic failures on 3 aircraft. I need you to call me the second you land. This isn't a drill. This is... He stopped, recalibrated. This could kill people. Call me. He hung up and dialed the FAA emergency line. On Flight 447, the plane shuddered again at 11:18, harder this time. Passengers gasped. A baby started crying. The seatbelt sign dinged on, harsh and insistent. Victoria's champagne sloshed out of her glass, staining the white sleeve of her suit jacket. What the hell was that? The flight attendant hurried past. Just turbulence, ma'am. Please keep your seatbelt fastened. But it wasn't turbulence. Darius knew the difference. Turbulence was random, chaotic. This was systematic, mechanical. He watched the wing flaps struggling to maintain position, saw the slight shimmer of hydraulic fluid misting from a connection point that should have been sealed. His training kicked in without conscious thought. Altitude, 32,000 feet based on cabin pressure. Airspeed, 400 plus knots from the sound of the engines and the way the clouds were passing. Hydraulic failure, primary system compromised, backup likely engaging or already failed based on the control surface behavior. The plane dropped suddenly 200 feet in 3 seconds. Passengers screamed. Overhead bins rattled. Oxygen masks stayed in their compartments. This wasn't an altitude emergency. Not yet. In row 14, Victoria grabbed her armrest with both hands. Oh God! Oh God! The intercom crackled. Captain Thomas Andrews' voice, strained but controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a primary hydraulic system failure. We're working to stabilize the aircraft using backup systems. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. Silence in the cabin. The kind that falls when every passenger simultaneously realizes they might die. Then the intercom again. Andrew's voice had changed. Still professional, but underneath the training, raw fear bleeding through. I need to make an unusual request. If there is anyone on board with military flight experience, specifically fighter pilot or tactical aviation experience, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. The cabin erupted. Passengers talking over each other, some crying, others demanding explanations the flight attendants couldn't provide. The businessman who'd toasted to keeping people in their place was praying under his breath in Spanish. Victoria turned to the window, face drained of color. Her hand found her phone, thumbs moving across the screen. A text appeared from her assistant, Jessica. Rob from engineering called. Emergency about Flight Master 7.2, critical flaws. Says it could... The message ended there, because Victoria's hands were shaking too badly to hold the phone steady. In row 32, Darius unbuckled his seatbelt. The college student beside him grabbed his arm. Where are you going? The seatbelt sign. Where I'm needed. He reached into the overhead bin and pulled out his duffel bag, unzipped it. Beneath the folded flag and the dress uniform, his flight jacket. Worn leather that had seen a dozen deployments, 100 training flights, countless hours in cockpits where the margin between life and death was measured in fractions of seconds. He pulled the jacket on. The weight of it settled across his shoulders like muscle memory. On the back, gold stitching. Echo 9. Below it, the F-22 Raptor patch of the 104th Fighter Squadron. Passengers nearby noticed. A woman in row 30. Oh my God, he's a pilot. The words spread like fire through dry grass. Fighter pilot. In the back. He's going up front. Sarah Blake appeared at the front of the economy section, scanning faces with desperate hope. She saw Darius standing in the aisle, saw the jacket, and her eyes widened. Sir, are you? Call sign Echo 9, F-22 Raptor Division, 104th Fighter Squadron, retired 3 years ago. Take me to the cockpit. Relief flooded her face so completely that she almost cried. Follow me, now. Darius moved forward through the cabin. Every passenger turned to watch him pass. Some reached out to touch his arm, his shoulder, desperate for the reassurance of his confidence. He met their eyes, nodded once, kept moving. Past row 25, row 20, row 15, where Emma clutched her toy fighter jet and whispered to her mother,
Mommy, is he going to save us?
Her mother, tears streaming, could only nod. Row 14. Victoria looked up as Darius passed. Their eyes met. Recognition crashed into her like a physical force. The maintenance worker. The man she'd mocked, dismissed, had removed from his seat because his presence offended her sense of order. Now wearing a flight jacket that told a story she'd been too arrogant to imagine. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Darius didn't slow down. "Stay calm, ma'am. We'll get through this." 3 words. No anger, no vindication, just the statement of someone who'd already moved past her relevance to focus on the problem that actually mattered. He kept walking. Behind him, Victoria sat frozen while the businessman across the aisle, Gerald Hastings according to his boarding pass, stared at her with something between disgust and horror. "That's the guy you kicked out of his seat." She couldn't answer, couldn't process. The plane shuddered again, and she gripped the armrest until her knuckles went white. Forward, past row 10, row 5, the galley. Sarah leading him to the cockpit door, knocking in a pattern that probably meant emergency. The door opened. Captain Andrews turned from the controls, face drenched in sweat. Beside him, the first officer, Michael Stevens, according to the name on his shirt, frantically cycled through switches and readouts. The cockpit was chaos. Alarms blaring, red lights across 3 panels, the hydraulic pressure gauges showing numbers that should have been impossible. "You're Echo 9? Andrew's voice carried hope and desperation in equal measure. "Yes, sir. Captain Darius Mitchell, F-22 Raptor Division, retired October 2021. Andrews exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. "You're in the military database. Thank God. Thank God." Darius stepped into the cockpit and the door closed behind him with a sound like a vault ceiling. The instrument panel told a story Darius had learned to read in a dozen different aircraft, across 100 different emergencies that existed only in simulators until they didn't. 3 hydraulic systems, each supposed to be independent, all showing pressure decay in patterns that suggested a common failure point. Not mechanical wear, not random malfunction. Something systematic, programmed, lethal. "What's the situation, Captain?" Andrews gestured at the gauges with a hand that trembled slightly. "Primary hydraulics failed at 11:15. Secondary engaged automatically, but lasted maybe 3 minutes. Tertiary is holding at 7% and dropping. We've got maybe 10 minutes before total flight control loss." Stevens kept his eyes on the controls, compensating for the sluggish response with constant micro-adjustments. "Backup electrical trim is responding, but barely. If we lose the tertiary system, we're flying a 200-ton glider with engines." Darius moved closer, scanning the readouts with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd trained for scenarios exactly like this. Altitude, 32,000 feet. Airspeed, 418 knots. Fuel state, sufficient for another 40 minutes at current consumption. Distance to nearest suitable airport, he glanced at the navigation display, 70 miles to Denver International. "What's your flight control software?" Stevens tapped a screen showing system information. "Aerotech Flightmaster 7.2. We updated to the latest version 6 days ago." The number hit Darius like a physical blow. 6 days. The same time frame Robert Patterson had mentioned in the voicemail Victoria was too important to answer. The same update that 3 Aerotech engineers had flagged as dangerous before some executive decided quarterly earnings mattered more than physics. Who authorized that update? Andrews checked the maintenance log displayed on his tablet. CEO signature required for major system changes. Victoria Hale approved it personally. The irony would have been funny if 204 lives weren't hanging in the balance. Darius felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the absolute clarity that came when consequences arrived to collect debts. She's on this plane. Row 14. Both pilots turned to stare at him. You're joking. Stephen's voice cracked slightly. I'm not. And we can have a conversation about corporate negligence after we land. Right now, I need you to show me what you've tried. Andrews ran through the checklist. Manual reversion protocols. Attempted. Minimal response. Rerouting hydraulic pressure through backup valves. Partially successful until the secondary system failed. Emergency descent to reduce stress on control surfaces. Considered, but rejected, because the tertiary system was already failing, and they might not be able to arrest the descent. Darius absorbed the information, his mind already 3 steps ahead. The problem wasn't the pilots. Andrews and Stevens had done everything commercial aviation training taught them to do. But commercial training assumed certain baseline conditions: functioning hydraulic systems, responsive control surfaces, software that didn't actively try to kill you. Fighter pilot training assumed none of that. Captain, I need you to trust me. I'm going to disengage the autopilot and fly this aircraft manually. Andrews hesitated. We don't train for full manual override in commercial aviation, not with degraded hydraulics. I know, but I do. Every single day in an F-22, we practiced flying with system failures. Hydraulics gone, engines out, half the flight controls offline. It's what fighter pilots are built for, taking broken aircraft and bringing them home. Stevens looked at Andrews. Andrews looked at the gauges showing pressure continuing to drop, looked at Darius, at the absolute confidence in his posture that suggested this was just another Tuesday for someone who'd landed damaged fighters in sandstorms and thunderstorms and situations where the margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in heartbeats. All right, she's yours. Darius slid into the jump seat behind the center console, positioning himself where he could see both the instruments and the view through the windscreen. Andrews moved his hands away from the yoke. The flight management computer still thought it was in charge, making tiny corrections to maintain altitude and heading, about to learn otherwise. I'm going to override the flight computer. When I do, the plane is going to want to do things the computer doesn't expect. It's going to feel wrong. But if we let the computer keep trying to compensate with hydraulics we don't have, we'll burn out what little system pressure remains. He reached for the override switch, paused, keyed the intercom. The cabin speakers crackled to life, and 203 passengers stopped whatever prayers or final texts or silent bargaining with God they'd been attempting. They heard a voice that sounded nothing like Captain Andrews' strained professionalism. This voice carried the weight of someone who'd been in worse situations and walked away. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Darius Mitchell speaking from the cockpit. We're experiencing a hydraulic system malfunction, but I want you to know, I have control of this aircraft. I've flown in situations like this before. We're going to make a priority landing in Denver. Stay seated, stay calm. We're bringing you home. In row 14, Victoria's head snapped up. That voice. The maintenance worker. The man whose existence she'd dismissed as beneath notice. Now in the cockpit telling her he had control, using the calm certainty of someone who'd never needed to prove himself because his competence spoke in frequencies louder than arrogance ever could. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Jessica. Rob says all planes with 7.2 need grounding. FAA has been notified. Oh God, Victoria, please tell me you're not. She didn't finish reading. Couldn't. The implications were cascading too fast to process. In row 15, Emma held her slightly bent fighter jet and whispered to her mother. He sounds like a superhero. Karen Hayes pulled her daughter close, tears making clean tracks through her makeup. He is, baby. He absolutely is. Dorothy Williams in row 12 clutched her rosary and felt something like peace settle over her fear. She'd been right about that young man. The Lord sent angels in unexpected forms. In row 32, where Darius's former seatmates had watched him walk forward in that flight jacket, the college student recorded everything on his phone. Broke a dozen FAA regulations doing it, But sometimes documenting miracles mattered more than following rules. Darius flipped the override switch. The autopilot disengaged with a mechanical click that seemed too quiet for the magnitude of what it represented. Instantly, the plane wanted to roll left. The software had been compensating for asymmetric hydraulic pressure with constant tiny corrections. Now those corrections stopped, and physics reasserted itself. Darius grabbed the yoke. The resistance felt like trying to turn a truck's steering wheel with the power assist disabled. He pulled right, gentle but firm, feeling for the edge of control authority. The plane responded sluggishly, like an injured animal that wasn't sure whether to trust or fight. "Hydraulics are at 6%, Stevens called out, watching gauges that continued their inexorable decline toward zero. "I see it. Captain, I need you to reduce thrust to 85%. We're going to ease the aerodynamic pressure on the control surfaces." Andrews pulled the throttles back. The engine note changed, dropping from the steady roar of cruise power to something quieter. The plane's response to control inputs became marginally less resistant. "Better. First officer, dial back the trim nose down 0.5 degrees. I'm going to hand fly us into a descent, but I need the plane wanting to come down with me, not fighting me." Stevens made the adjustment. Darius felt the difference immediately. Subtle, but in a situation where every percentage point of control authority mattered, subtle was the difference between landing and auguring into the Colorado plains at terminal velocity. He began the descent, not the aggressive emergency drop that regulations might suggest, but smooth and calculated. Losing altitude at 2,000 feet per minute, watching the artificial horizon, making constant micro-corrections with arms that would be screaming in 30 minutes from the physical effort of wrestling control surfaces that barely wanted to respond. The memories came without invitation. Nevada desert 6 years ago, standing on the tarmac at Nellis with Marcus before that final training flight. The conversation they'd had about what separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Marcus had been checking his aircraft, running through pre-flight with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details saved lives. "You know the difference between flying and really flying, Rowan?" "What's that?" "Flying is what you do when everything works. Really flying is what you do when nothing works, and you make it work anyway. That's when you stop being a pilot and become part of the aircraft itself." Marcus had climbed into his F-22 that morning and never climbed out. Mid-air collision with two rookie pilots who'd converged on the same coordinates. Marcus had put his fighter between them, absorbed the impact, saved their lives. His ejection seat malfunctioned. The aircraft came apart across 40 square miles of scrubland. Darius had been in the tower when the radio traffic came through, heard Marcus's final transmission, calm despite the fact that his jet was disintegrating around him, thinking not about himself, but about the people who'd miss him. That voice echoed now in the cockpit of Flight 447. "Don't fight the sky, Rowan. Dance with it." Darius let his eyes close for 2 seconds, breathed. When he opened them again, the plane had drifted 3 degrees off heading. He corrected without conscious thought, hands and feet moving in coordination that bypassed rational processing and went straight to muscle memory built over thousands of hours. "Hydraulics at 5%. Stevens' voice held the kind of control that came from forcing panic down through sheer professionalism. "Acknowledged. Denver Control, this is Flight 447. We're beginning emergency descent, requesting priority landing runway 34 right." The radio crackled, a controller's voice steady despite the situation. "Flight 447, Denver Control. Roger your emergency. You're cleared direct, runway 34 right. Wind calm. All other traffic is being diverted. Emergency equipment is positioning now." "Understood, Control. Souls on board, 204. Fuel state, 35 minutes. "Copy, 447. What's your hydraulic situation?" 5% and falling. We'll be on manual control for the approach." Brief pause, then. "Roger, you're cleared to land any runway, any direction. Fire equipment is standing by. Good luck, 447. The cabin remained silent, except for the changed engine note and the occasional sob or whispered prayer. Darius kept his focus on the instruments, on the feel of the yoke under his hands, on the thousands of tiny inputs required to keep the aircraft stable. At 28,000 feet, the plane shuddered hard. The tertiary hydraulic system dropped to 3%. Control authority decreased by half. What had been difficult became nearly impossible. Stevens inhaled sharply. "We're losing it." The plane wanted to roll right now, the asymmetric pressure finally overwhelming the electrical backup systems. Darius pulled left with both hands, arms straining, and gained maybe 2 degrees of correction. Not enough. Andrews reached for the radio. "Denver Control, we may need to—" "Wait!" Darius's voice cut through the rising panic. "Wait!" He closed his eyes again, heard Marcus's voice across 6 years and an unbridgeable distance between the living and the dead. "You don't fly the plane. You become the plane." The physics were simple. Aerodynamic pressure increased with speed. Control surfaces became more effective with higher air velocity. But speed also increased stress on the airframe. The balance point existed somewhere in that equation, had to exist, because the alternative was unthinkable. "Captain, cut thrust to 65%. Now!" "That's insane. We'll stall. Trust me!" Andrews pulled the throttles back. The engines spooled down. Airspeed began to bleed off. The plane's roll accelerated for 3 seconds, 4, 5, then slowed. The reduced velocity decreased aerodynamic pressure on the control surfaces. What little hydraulic authority remained became proportionally more effective. Darius used that narrow window to level the wings, then pushed the throttles forward again before they bled off too much speed. The plane stabilized at 25,000 feet. Stevens stared at him. "How did you know that would work?" "I didn't. Marcus did." "Who's Marcus?" "My wingman. He died teaching me that lesson." Nobody spoke for 30 seconds. The only sounds were the engines, the airflow, the constant background chorus of alarms that nobody could silence because the problems they indicated were real and immediate and potentially fatal. Andrews broke the silence. "We're 40 miles from Denver. Hydraulics are at 2%. If we lose them completely before we're on final approach, we work with what we have when we have it. First officer, configure for landing. Gear down, no flaps." "No flaps? Sir, our approach speed will be 20 knots faster than normal, I know. We don't have the hydraulic pressure for flaps anyway. Gear only." Stevens reached for the landing gear lever, hesitated. "If the gear doesn't extend, we're landing on the belly. If the gear doesn't extend, we land on the belly. But we're landing." The lever moved. A grinding sound reverberated through the airframe as the landing gear doors opened and the wheels extended. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. Left main gear down and locked. Right main gear down and locked. Nose gear. The 3rd light stayed red. "Nose gear indicates unsafe." Darius didn't react, just processed the new variable and recalculated. "Can you extend it manually?" "Not enough hydraulic pressure for the backup system." "Then we land on 2 main gear and hold the nose off as long as possible. When it comes down, it comes down." Andrews looked at him with something between awe and terror. "You've done this before?" "In an F-22, yes. Nose gear failure over Nevada during a training flight. Landed on the mains, held the nose off until I ran out of elevator authority, let it drop on the reinforced structure designed for exactly that scenario. Walked away without a scratch." "This isn't an F-22. This is a 737 with 203 passengers who didn't sign up for test pilot maneuvers." Darius met his eyes. "This is 204 people who are going to walk away from this. That's not a maneuver. That's a promise." The conviction in his voice left no room for argument. Andrews nodded once and turned back to his instruments. While Darius flew, while he calculated angles and velocities and the 1,000 micro-adjustments required to keep metal and physics in temporary cooperation, the ground began responding to the emergency with the systematic efficiency of systems designed for exactly this scenario. At Denver International Airport, Fire Chief Martinez watched Flight 447's track on radar and positioned his equipment accordingly. 12 trucks, 3 ambulances, paramedics, and rescue personnel numbering 67 in total. All of them hoping they'd spend the next hour standing around doing nothing, because the alternative meant body bags and investigations and trauma that would echo through careers and families for years. In the control tower, the watch supervisor diverted all incoming traffic to Colorado Springs and Grand Junction. Runway 34 right belonged to Flight 447 now. 12,000 feet of concrete and precision approach lights, waiting. News helicopters launched from 3 different stations. Live footage would be on air in minutes, broadcast to millions of people who'd watch a disaster unfold in real time, or witness something they'd tell their grandchildren about. The line between those outcomes was being decided by a maintenance worker in a worn flight jacket who'd learned to dance with the sky from a dead man. On Wall Street, 3,000 miles away and 2 time zones ahead, Aerotech Solutions' stock price began to move. Not official trading, markets were closed, but after-hours movement as word spread through investment networks that one of their aircraft was experiencing a catastrophic software failure. $847 per share at market close. $823 in after-hours trading. $801. $768. Algorithms picked up the momentum and accelerated the slide. Human traders saw the pattern and piled on, shorting positions, dumping holdings, running for exits before the real news broke. In Seattle, at Aerotech headquarters, the board of directors convened an emergency call. 9 faces on video screens, all of them performing rapid calculations about liability and insurance coverage and whether the company would survive whatever was about to happen to Flight 447. The chairman spoke first. "Where is Victoria?" The general counsel pulled up a passenger manifest, went pale. "She's on the plane." Silence. Then someone laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Jesus Christ. She's on the plane her own software is killing. Do we have any way to contact her?" "She's in flight. No connectivity unless she paid for Wi-Fi." "Try anyway. We need damage control protocols in place before that aircraft lands. Or doesn't." They tried. Victoria's phone remained unreachable, buried in her purse in row 14, while she sat paralyzed with the understanding that every decision she'd made in the past 6 months had led directly to this moment. The engineers she'd overruled, the warnings she'd dismissed, the safety protocols she'd circumvented because IPO deadlines mattered more than theoretical risks that only became real when 204 people found themselves in a metal tube 30,000 feet above Colorado, with hydraulic fluid spraying into the slipstream. Her phone buzzed again. The board chairman, calling repeatedly. She didn't answer. Couldn't. What would she say? That she'd prioritized stock prices over human lives and was now discovering that consequences existed even for people who considered themselves too important to face them? Gerald Hastings across the aisle wasn't praying anymore, wasn't doing anything except staring at her with an expression that held no sympathy, no shared terror, just cold judgment. "You did this," he finally spoke. "Your company. Your software." Victoria's voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know. That's worse." In the cockpit, Darius brought the aircraft down through 20,000 feet. The hydraulic pressure gauge showed 1%. Might as well have read 0 for all the control authority that remained. He was flying on electrical trim and aerodynamic force, using speed and angle of attack to make the control surfaces effective without the hydraulic boost that made modern aircraft manageable. Every input required full strength. His shoulders burned, his forearms cramped. Sweat ran down his back despite the cockpit temperature being set to 68 degrees. This was physical labor on a scale commercial pilots never experienced, and he still had the landing to execute. 15,000 feet. The Denver metro area spread out below, highways like arteries carrying blood cells that didn't know how close they were to disaster. If the plane went down now, it would hit suburbs, homes, schools. The number of souls on board would multiply exponentially. 10 miles from the field, Stevens called out. Hydraulics at 0.8%. Acknowledged. Captain, tell the cabin to brace. Andrews keyed the intercom. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Brace position on my command. Sarah Blake moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency born of training that never quite prepared you for the real thing. Heads down! Stay down! Brace! 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 Passengers complied. Some prayed. Others texted final messages to family members, hoping the cell signal at lower altitude would get through. A few recorded video, because humans document everything now, even their own potential deaths. Emma held her fighter jet and her mother's hand with equal intensity. The pilot man is going to save us, right, Mommy? Karen couldn't speak, could only hold her daughter and hope the universe was kind enough to let this child see 9 years old. Dorothy Williams had her rosary wrapped around both hands, lips moving silently through Hail Marys she'd memorized 70 years ago in a church that probably didn't exist anymore. The words remained, though, constant across decades, offering whatever comfort repetition and faith could provide. Victoria assumed the brace position mechanically, her body following instructions, while her mind spiraled through everything she'd destroyed in pursuit of ambitions that seemed monumentally stupid when measured against the prospect of dying in a plane crash caused by your own negligence. 5 miles out. Darius could see the runway now, a long, straight line of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from 3,000 feet up. The approach lights blinked their welcome. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway, tiny from this altitude, but growing larger with every second. Hydraulics at 0.3%. Stephen's voice had gone flat. Emotional shutdown in the face of numbers that kept finding new ways to get worse. We're committed. Darius's arms screamed, but his voice remained steady. Call out altitude. 2,000 feet. The plane descended. Darius held the approach angle perfect, using engine power to control descent rate, using the sluggish control surfaces to maintain alignment with the runway centerline. No autopilot, no flight director, just eyes and hands and the accumulated experience of 1,000 landings translating into muscle memory that functioned when conscious thought would have been too slow. 1,000 feet. The runway filled the windscreen. Darius could see individual markings now, the painted numbers that designated 34 right. Could see the fire trucks, the foam equipment, the ambulances waiting. 500 feet. His hands made constant micro-adjustments. The yoke moved maybe an inch in any direction, but those inches mattered absolutely. The plane wanted to drift right. He corrected. It wanted to sink too fast. He added power. The hydraulics gave him nothing. He worked with airflow and momentum and faith. 200 feet. Brace! 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 Andrew's voice filled the cabin. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. Karen wrapped her body around her daughter's. Dorothy Williams finished her prayer and waited to meet God or see another sunrise. 100 feet. Darius pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted fractionally. The main wheels reached for pavement. For half a second, the aircraft hung suspended between flight and ground, belonging to neither. Then contact. The main landing gear struck concrete with force that would have been gentle in a normal landing, but felt violent now. The plane bounced once, came down again harder. The nose wanted to drop, but Darius held it off, using what little elevator authority remained and the decreasing airspeed to keep the broken nose gear assembly from slamming into the runway. Reverse thrust! Emergency braking! Andrews pushed the throttles to their stops. The engines howled in reverse. Brakes engaged with pressure that should have been impossible given the hydraulic state. But some emergency accumulator somewhere deep in the aircraft systems had enough reserve to matter. The plane decelerated. 30 seconds of metal screaming against concrete, of forces trying to tear the airframe apart, of Darius holding the nose off the runway through pure strength and technique, until finally, inevitably, the aerodynamic authority bled away and the nose came down. Metal hit pavement. Sparks erupted like fireworks. The nose gear assembly that had never properly extended dragged along the runway, grinding and shrieking. The plane pulled hard right. Darius corrected with asymmetric braking, fighting to keep the aircraft on the center line. 4,000 feet of runway consumed. 3,000. 2,000. The plane slowing but still moving fast enough to kill everyone if it departed the runway into the grass. 1,000 feet remaining. 500. The aircraft shuddered to a stop 157 feet from the end of the runway. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The cockpit filled with the silence that comes after violence, after terror. After the universe grants mercy, it had no obligation to provide. Then Andrews started laughing. Not humor, release, pure emotional overflow. "We're down. We're alive. Holy God, we're alive." Stevens had tears running down his face. I didn't think. Darius released the yoke. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline dump hitting hard enough to make his teeth chatter. He'd held it together through the crisis because that's what training demanded. Now the training was over, and his body was collecting payment for every second of suppressed terror. "Good work, gentlemen. You kept this aircraft together long enough for me to land it. That took courage." Andrews turned to look at him. "You just saved 204 lives." "We all did, Captain." This was a team effort. The cockpit door opened. Sarah stood there, tears streaming, unable to speak. Behind her, the cabin had erupted. Applause, crying, laughter, prayers of thanksgiving. The sounds of people who'd accepted death and received life instead. Darius stood on legs that didn't quite want to support his weight, stepped through the cockpit door into the cabin. The applause intensified, became something physical, a wave of gratitude that nearly knocked him over. He walked the aisle. Passengers reached for him, shook his hand, touched his jacket. A businessman from row 20 grabbed both his hands and wouldn't let go. "My daughter's getting married next week. I get to walk her down the aisle because of you." Dorothy Williams caught his arm as he passed row 12. "God bless you, son. You're an angel in human form." He smiled at her, genuine warmth breaking through the exhaustion. "Just a pilot, ma'am. Just doing what I was trained to do." Row 14. Victoria stood there, mascara destroyed, designer suit wrinkled and stained with champagne. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not understanding, just the acknowledgement of how completely circumstances had inverted. Her voice cracked. I need to... "Not now, ma'am. Let's get everyone off safely first." He kept moving. Row 15. Emma broke free from her mother's grip and ran into the aisle, held up a piece of paper she'd been drawing on during the crisis, crayon on a cocktail napkin. A stick figure with wings. An airplane. Words in unsteady letters. Hero pilot. Darius knelt, eye level with her. His throat tightened. "Is this for me?" She nodded seriously. "This is you. You saved us." He took the drawing like it was made of something more precious than paper and wax. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm going to keep this forever." She hugged him, fierce and sudden. He hugged her back, thinking of Amara waiting at home with Mrs. Williams, not knowing how close she'd come to losing her father today. The emergency slides deployed. Passengers evacuated in organized chaos, sliding down inflated chutes to where paramedics waited. Some were crying. Others laughed with the manic energy of people whose adrenaline had nowhere else to go. All of them alive, when minutes ago that outcome had been anything but certain. Darius stood on the tarmac and watched the evacuation with the detached professionalism of someone conducting an after-action review. 197 passengers accounted for, flight crew of 7, everyone ambulatory. No serious injuries visible. A successful outcome by every metric that mattered. 3 black SUVs pulled up near the aircraft. Federal plates. FBI, probably, or FAA, or some acronym agency that would want statements and reports and explanations that would take weeks to properly document. A man in his late 40s emerged from the lead vehicle. Dark suit, serious expression, badge on his belt identifying him as Agent Frank Morris. He scanned the crowd, found Victoria Hale sitting on the tarmac away from the other passengers, and walked directly toward her. Victoria Hale? She looked up, fear and resignation mixing in her expression. FBI, I need you to come with me. What? Why? Because your company's software just nearly killed 204 people, and we have evidence you authorized its release despite explicit warnings from your engineering team. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: denial, anger, understanding, terror. I want my lawyer. You'll get a phone call. Let's go. 2 other agents moved in, helping her to her feet with a firmness that suggested cooperation wasn't optional. Cameras from the news helicopters captured everything. The CEO, in her expensive wrinkled suit, being escorted toward an FBI vehicle, while behind her, the plane she'd nearly destroyed sat on the runway, surrounded by emergency equipment. Passengers watched. Some cheered. Others looked away, unable to find satisfaction in anyone's humiliation, even when it was deserved. Gerald Hastings gave an interview to a reporter who'd made it through the security perimeter somehow. That woman spent the entire flight treating people like they were beneath her, mocking a man who turned out to be the only reason any of us are alive. Karma doesn't just exist, it keeps perfect accounts. The video of Victoria being led away by federal agents hit social media within minutes. The passenger footage from inside the cabin, shaky phone video showing her throwing Emma's toy, demanding Darius be removed, crying as he walked forward to save the plane, followed 30 seconds later. 500,000 views in 20 minutes. 2 million in an hour. By the time the sun set over Denver, the story had spread across every platform, every network, every corner of the internet where people gathered to watch the powerful face consequences they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. 6 months transformed everything. Not gradually, not with the merciful slowness that lets people adjust to new realities. Victoria Hale's world collapsed in stages, each one documented and dissected, and shared across platforms where strangers who'd never met her felt entitled to opinions about her destruction. The criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. Federal courthouse in Denver, packed gallery, cameras outside because Colorado allowed them, and this was the kind of spectacle that drew crowds. The prosecution built their case with the methodical precision of architects constructing a building they knew would stand for decades. Email after email, displayed on screens for the jury. Victoria's own words, preserved in digital permanence. I don't care what the engineers say. Stock price matters more than theoretical risks. We ship on schedule, regardless of their paranoia. Robert Patterson testified for 4 hours. Explained how 3 senior engineers had flagged the Flightmaster 7.2 update as dangerous. Showed the documented warnings, the safety review recommendations, the explicit prediction that hydraulic systems could fail in cascade patterns under specific load conditions. Described how Victoria had overridden every objection because the IPO timeline mattered more than the possibility that people might die. The defense argued that aviation software was complex, that no one could predict every failure mode, that Victoria had relied on subordinates who should have been more forceful in their warnings. The jury didn't buy it. When you have emails saying, "I don't care what the engineers say," followed 3 weeks later by a mere crash that matched the engineers' predictions exactly, intent becomes difficult to obscure. The judge read the sentence on a Thursday morning in late September. Victoria stood in an orange jumpsuit that fit poorly, hands cuffed in front, hair pulled back without the careful styling that had once defined her public image. Ms. Hale, you prioritized corporate profit over human life. 204 people nearly died because you chose quarterly earnings over safety. The fact that you were also on that aircraft doesn't absolve you. It merely demonstrates that consequences exist even for those who consider themselves immune to them. 7 years in federal prison, $50 million fine, lifetime ban from serving as a corporate officer in any publicly traded company. Victoria's knees buckled. The bailiff caught her before she hit the floor. They led her away while reporters typed furiously and sketch artists captured the moment for outlets that couldn't use cameras inside. The civil suits settled for $340 million total. Every passenger received compensation. Some took the money gratefully. Others donated portions to aviation safety foundations or scholarship funds for children of pilots. Emma Hayes' family put their settlement into a trust for her education. She'd asked if some of it could go to Mr. Mitchell, the pilot man who'd saved her. Her parents explained that heroes didn't do it for money, which was a concept 7-year-olds struggled with but eventually accepted. Victoria's assets barely covered a fraction of the judgment. The Manhattan penthouse sold at auction. The vacation home in the Hamptons went next. Jewelry, art collection, the Tesla she'd driven maybe twice, all of it liquidated to pay debts that would follow her beyond prison walls and into whatever remained of her life afterward. The divorce finalized in October. Richard Hale's lawyers had been efficient, using a prenuptial agreement Victoria had signed without reading because she'd been too confident, too certain that she'd always be the one with leverage. He kept everything the prenup specified, which was nearly everything, walked away from their marriage with his investment banking career intact and a new girlfriend already being photographed at charity events Victoria used to organize. Her friends vanished with the same speed as her bank accounts. Lauren stopped returning calls after the second week. The country club revoked her membership. Charity boards removed her name from websites, literally erasing her contributions as though association with failure was contagious. Federal Correctional Institution Danbury sat in Connecticut among trees that turned brilliant colors in autumn, mocking the gray uniformity of the buildings and the beige monotony of institutional life within them. Victoria's cell measured 6 feet by 8 feet, shared with a former pharmaceutical executive who'd been convicted of securities fraud and spent most of her time reading legal journals and planning appeals that would probably go nowhere. The cellmate, Patricia something, Victoria never learned her last name, had advice born of 18 months inside. You'll get used to it. The food is terrible, the mattress is worse, and the other inmates either want to fight you or convert you. Pick your battles, keep your head down, and the time passes. Slowly, but it passes. Victoria couldn't imagine 7 years of this. Couldn't conceive of the person she'd become after 84 months of institution meals and shared toilets and the constant low-level anxiety that came from being surrounded by people who'd also lost everything, and some of whom blamed the system, while others blamed themselves. Thanksgiving arrived with institutional turkey that tasted like cardboard and cranberry sauce from a can. The cafeteria filled with women eating in small groups or alone, conversations muted by the acoustics, and the collective awareness that this wasn't where any of them had imagined spending the holidays. Victoria sat by herself at a table near the windows that overlooked the recreation yard. Outside, bare trees swayed in November wind. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed at frequencies that made concentration difficult and sleep elusive. Someone had taped paper decorations to the walls, turkeys made from construction paper, the kind elementary school students created. The irony of decorating a prison with symbols of gratitude didn't escape her. Her lawyer had visited once since the sentencing, brought paperwork finalizing the civil settlements, and news that Aerotech Solutions had filed for bankruptcy. The company she'd spent 15 years building. Gone. Dissolved. Absorbed by a competitor who bought the intellectual property for pennies on the dollar and left the liabilities to be handled by trustees and courts. You'll still owe the settlement amounts after you're released. Wage garnishment, probably, for whatever work you can find. The bankruptcy doesn't eliminate your personal liability. She'd asked about appeals. He'd given her a look that communicated more than words. Appeals required grounds and money, and she had neither. The evidence against her had been overwhelming. The sentence had been within guidelines. No appellate court would overturn a conviction this clean. He hadn't visited again. The final bill for his services sat in her cell, a reminder that even in destruction, there were costs that accumulated. 3,000 miles west, a different kind of Thanksgiving unfolded in a 2-bedroom apartment that hadn't changed in the 6 months since Darius Mitchell had walked through its door after saving 204 lives. Same furniture, same photographs on the walls, same used Honda Civic in the parking lot, showing 251,000 miles now, and still running fine. Amara set the table with the careful concentration of an 8-year-old who'd been given an important task. Forks on the left, knives and spoons on the right, napkins folded into triangles because Mrs. Williams had shown her how, and practice mattered. The guest list was small. Mrs. Patricia Williams from next door, who'd watched Amara more times than Darius could count. Elena Washington and her 2 children, Marcus's widow, and the family Darius had promised to look after. A few neighbors who'd become friends through the gradual accumulation of shared hallways and borrowed tools and the casual intimacy of people who lived parallel lives. The turkey came from the grocery store already cooked because Darius's culinary skills stopped at scrambled eggs and pasta. The sides were potluck contributions. Mrs. Williams brought sweet potato casserole. Elena made her mother's cornbread dressing recipe. Darius provided the apartment and the beverages and the gratitude for people who'd supported him through years when support was the only thing keeping him vertical. They gathered around a table that barely fit everyone, elbows touching, plates overlapping, the comfortable crowding of people who didn't need physical space to feel welcome. Darius said a brief grace, thanking God for food and safety and the presence of people who mattered, and then the conversation flowed into the easy rhythms of family, whether bound by blood or choice. Elena's oldest asked about the airplane. Every conversation eventually found its way there, no matter how many times Darius tried to redirect toward literally anything else. Did you really land without the nose gear? The gear didn't extend properly, so yes, we landed without it. Were you scared? Darius considered the question seriously because children deserved honest answers. Yes, but fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you work harder to make sure things turn out okay. Amara beamed with the pride of a daughter whose father had become a public figure without seeking it. She'd brought the crayon drawing Emma had given him to school for show and tell. Her teacher had asked if Mr. Mitchell would come speak to the class. Darius had politely declined, explaining that he was just a maintenance worker who'd done his job, and other people's jobs were equally important. The teacher had persisted. Amara had persisted. Eventually, he'd agreed to a 15-minute talk about aviation careers, during which he'd spent most of the time emphasizing that being a mechanic mattered as much as being a pilot, that every role in aviation contributed to safety, that the janitor who kept the hangars clean was as essential as the engineer who designed the aircraft. The students had asked about the emergency landing anyway. He'd kept it brief, age-appropriate, focused on teamwork and training, rather than the terror of flying a crippled aircraft with 200 lives depending on split-second decisions. Mrs. Williams redirected the conversation now with the gentle authority of someone who'd been managing family dynamics for 7 decades. I saw they're putting Marcus's name on a safety foundation. That's a wonderful legacy. Elena nodded, eyes bright. The Marcus Washington Aviation Safety Foundation. They've already prevented 2 other incidents. Software reviews caught problems before aircraft were updated. He would have loved that. All those years he spent writing reports that nobody read, and now they're finally listening. Darius had found those reports 3 months after Flight 447. Boxes of them in Marcus's storage unit that Elena had asked him to help clean out. Documentation of near misses, software glitches, maintenance issues that Marcus had flagged through official channels. Most had been dismissed or deprioritized because they were theoretical risks rather than actual disasters. Reading through them had been like hearing Marcus's voice again. The same attention to detail, the same insistence that small problems became catastrophic ones if ignored, the same frustration with systems that prioritized schedules over safety margins. Darius had taken the reports to the FAA himself, presented them to investigators who were examining the Flightmaster 7.2 failure. They'd used Marcus's documentation to build the case against Aerotech, to demonstrate that the problems weren't unforeseeable. They'd been explicitly documented and deliberately ignored. The foundation was Elena's idea, using settlement money from the civil suit to create an independent organization that reviewed aviation software updates before they were deployed. Staffed by retired engineers and pilots who understood both the technical systems and the institutional pressures that could compromise safety. Named for a man who died trying to prevent exactly the kind of disaster that had nearly occurred 6 months ago. Dinner finished. Dishes got cleared. Someone produced a deck of cards and a board game appeared from somewhere. The evening settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who enjoyed each other's company without needing constant entertainment. Around 8 o'clock, Darius stepped onto the apartment balcony for air. The November night was cold enough to see breath, quiet enough to hear traffic from the highway 3 blocks over. He leaned against the railing and looked at stars struggling to compete with light pollution. Elena joined him, wrapping a cardigan tighter against the chill. They stood in silence for a moment, comfortable with each other in the way people who'd shared grief understood. "You're still working at the airport." "Still fixing planes. Same job I had before." "You could work anywhere now. Airlines made offers. Boeing called. That defense contractor wanted you to consult on something classified." "I like fixing things. Making sure aircraft are safe before they leave the ground. Seems like that matters." Elena smiled. "Marcus said the same thing. Always wanted to be in the hangar, not the briefing room. Said he learned more from mechanics than from officers." They watched the city lights for another minute. Then Elena spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of something she'd been holding. "I'm glad he taught you what he did. About flying, about staying calm. But I'm also glad he's not here to see what almost happened. Would have broken his heart, knowing his warnings were ignored." He knew they were being ignored. That's what frustrated him. But he kept trying, kept filing reports, kept pushing. That's who he was. Darius thought about the boxes of documentation, the careful notes, the escalating urgency in Marcus's language as problems went unaddressed, a man shouting into a void that didn't echo. The foundation will make sure people listen now. That's something. It is, and you being part of it matters. When you tell engineers that their concerns are valid, that speaking up saves lives, they listen, because you're living proof. Inside, Amara's laughter rang out over some card game development. The sound pulled both of them back from the edge of memories that could consume entire evenings if permitted. "She's proud of you," Elena observed. "She shouldn't be. I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly why she should be proud. You didn't make it about you. Didn't chase fame or fortune, just went back to work and kept being her father." The awards had come anyway. Congressional Medal of Valor, presented at a ceremony in Washington that Darius attended because declining would have been disrespectful to the institution rather than humble. The medal sat in a drawer now, next to Marcus's ribbons and the folded flag from his funeral. Important for what they represented, irrelevant to daily life. The speaking invitations continued. Universities wanted him to lecture. Aviation conferences requested keynotes. Media outlets offered interview slots on programs Darius had never watched. He declined most of them, accepted a few when the cause seemed worthwhile: veteran support organizations, aviation safety seminars, scholarship events for children of military families. The money from those appearances went into a college fund for Amara and donations to causes Marcus would have supported. Darius kept his mechanic's salary, kept his apartment, kept the life he'd built before 204 strangers had depended on him for 90 terrifying minutes. The community college where he volunteered had expanded its aviation program on the strength of his involvement. More students enrolling, more funding from donors who'd been inspired by the narrative of a hero who went back to teaching maintenance instead of cashing in. The students called him Mr. Mitchell and listened when he explained that every bolt mattered, every safety check counted, that the difference between tragedy and triumph often came down to someone caring enough to do their job correctly when nobody was watching. One student, Marcus Jr., named for his uncle who'd died before he was born, had asked why Darius still worked for an hourly wage when he could make millions. Darius had looked at the kid, really looked, seen the genuine confusion that came from a generation raised to believe wealth was the only meaningful measure of success. Money is what you have. Worth is what you do with it. I have enough money. My daughter has food, clothes, a roof. We're safe. What I don't have enough of is time to teach people skills that might save lives someday. That seems more valuable than a bigger car. The answer had confused the student, but it planted something. Darius saw it in the way the kid approached his work afterward. More careful, more deliberate, less concerned with finishing quickly and more focused on finishing correctly. Back inside the apartment, Mrs. Williams announced she needed to get home before her show started. Elena gathered her children, hugs exchanged, dishes packed up, promises to do this again soon that everyone meant and would actually follow through on, because these were people who kept commitments. After everyone left, Darius helped Amara with her nightly routine. Teeth brushed, pajamas on, a chapter from whatever book they were reading, currently something about a girl who solved mysteries with her dog. She was asleep by 9:30, curled around a stuffed animal that had been Keisha's before it became Amara's. Darius sat in the living room with the lights off, just the glow from the kitchen providing enough illumination to see shapes but not details. Emma's crayon drawing hung on the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like an airplane. Next to it, a letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago. The letter was from Emma's mother, Karen, thanking him again, updating him on Emma's recovery from nightmares about the flight, letting him know she'd started drawing constantly, always pictures of planes and pilots and people being saved. The therapist said it was healthy processing. Karen thought maybe Emma would grow up to be a pilot herself, inspired by the man who'd kept his promise to keep his plane safe. The letter ended with an invitation to visit if he was ever in Las Vegas, where they'd been headed that day. Emma asked about him constantly, Karen wrote, wanted to know if he still had her drawing, if he'd flown any more planes, if he remembered her. Darius had written back, brief but genuine. Yes, he still had the drawing. No, he hadn't flown again. His job was fixing planes, not flying them. And yes, he remembered her very clearly. Would always remember her, because she'd been brave when being brave was hard, and that mattered more than people realized. He didn't mention the nightmares he'd had for 2 months after the flight, the ones where the hydraulics failed completely before he could reach the runway, where the plane rolled inverted and there was nothing he could do except write it down. Waking up in sweat-soaked sheets, Amara shaking his shoulder because he'd been talking in his sleep. Those had faded, mostly, replaced by the regular anxiety dreams everyone carried, showing up late, forgetting important tasks, the standard background noise of a mind processing stress through surreal scenarios. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Happened occasionally, journalists who'd obtained his contact information, strangers who wanted to thank him or ask questions or propose business opportunities that always involved him being more visible than he wanted to be. This one was different. Mr. Mitchell, this is Robert Patterson from Aerotech Engineering. I wanted to thank you for what you did, and to apologize for not fighting harder against the 7.2 update. I knew it was dangerous. Should have resigned rather than let it ship. Your skill saved people from my cowardice. Darius stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a response. You tried to stop it. That's more than most people do. Don't carry guilt for someone else's decisions. The reply came quickly. Thank you. That means more than you know. If you're ever in Seattle, I'd like to buy you dinner. Talk about the foundation work. Marcus's reports changed how we think about safety advocacy. I'll let you know if I'm out that way. Take care. He set the phone down and leaned back on the couch that had come from a thrift store and would probably last another decade because furniture either worked or it didn't, and expensive didn't mean better. The contrast wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, Victoria Hale had been sitting in first class, drinking champagne and dismissing people like him as beneath notice. Now she was in a federal prison, eating institutional food and facing 7 years of consequences for prioritizing her comfort over other people's safety. Darius didn't take satisfaction in her destruction, just recognized it as the natural outcome of choices she'd made repeatedly, deliberately, with full knowledge that she was trading potential disaster for quarterly profits. The universe didn't always enforce accountability, but when it did, the bill came due with interest. The memorial service happened on a Saturday in December, 6 years to the day after Marcus had died in Nevada desert. Nellis Air Force Base hadn't changed much. Same hangars, same runway, same F-22s sitting on the flight line looking like predatory birds waiting to hunt. Darius wore his dress uniform with the new medals he hadn't requested, but couldn't decline. Silver Star. The citation reading, for extraordinary heroism in saving 204 lives through superior airmanship and courage under extreme duress. It sat above his earlier decorations, the weight of it pulling slightly on the fabric. Amara walked beside him in a navy dress that Mrs. Williams had helped her pick out. She held his hand, quiet and observant in the way children were when they sensed the gravity of adult emotions they couldn't fully comprehend. The ceremony drew 200 people, veterans, active duty pilots, families of fallen aviators. A senator spoke about sacrifice and service. The base commander discussed Marcus's contributions to aviation safety. Elena gave a eulogy that focused on Marcus as a father and husband rather than a warrior, which felt more honest than the official narratives that turned complicated humans into simplified heroes. When it was Darius's turn at the podium, he spoke without notes, just looked at the crowd and at Marcus's photograph and tried to explain what 6 years of processing had taught him. Heroes aren't the ones with medals. They're not the ones whose names trend on social media. Heroes are people who keep showing up, keep speaking up, keep doing what's right, even when nobody's listening. The crowd was silent. He continued. Marcus filed reports for years about software issues that could kill people. Those reports were ignored. He died before seeing whether anyone would finally pay attention. 6 months ago, the problems he documented nearly caused a disaster. If he'd been alive to see that, it would have broken him. Elena nodded from the front row. Her oldest son sat beside her, wearing Marcus's aviator watch, the same one Darius had carried for 6 years before deciding it belonged with family rather than the friend who'd survived. But his reports survived. And when investigators needed to understand why Flight Master 7.2 failed, Marcus's documentation gave them the roadmap. He saved lives from beyond the grave, which is what heroes do. They build things that outlast them. 4 F-22s streaked overhead in missing man formation. The crowd looked up. One aircraft broke away, climbing vertical into the December sky. Darius tracked its path until it disappeared into the sun. People ask me how I stayed calm during the emergency. The truth is, Marcus was flying that plane with me. His voice, his training, his refusal to give up even when systems failed. I just moved the controls. He did the flying. The words carried across the airfield, amplified by speakers, but powered by belief. Every pilot in the crowd understood. The ones who'd taught you never really left. They lived in the procedures you followed, the decisions you made, the calm certainty that came from training so thorough, it became instinct. After the ceremony, Darius found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand or share their own stories about Marcus. He listened to each one, gave them the time they needed, understood that memory was how humans defeated death. Senator Richard Caldwell approached, flanked by aides who looked uncomfortable in their suits on a military base. "Mr. Mitchell, I wanted to personally thank you for your service, both during your military career and 6 months ago." "Just did my job, Senator." "That's what everyone says. But jobs are just tasks we're paid for. What you did was far beyond any reasonable job description." The senator had come because the Marcus Washington Aviation Safety Foundation needed political support, needed legislation mandating independent software reviews, needed the kind of institutional backing that turned good ideas into permanent policy. Darius understood the calculation. Politicians appeared at events with heroes because association with heroism was valuable currency. But calculation didn't make the cause less worthy. If the senator's self-interest aligned with preventing future disasters, Darius would shake his hand and pose for photographs and provide whatever legitimacy his presence offered. They took pictures. The senator's team distributed them to news outlets. By evening, they'd appear in articles about bipartisan cooperation on aviation safety reform. Darius would be mentioned as the hero pilot who supported the legislation. Marcus's name would trend briefly on platforms where attention was measured in hours. Then the cycle would move on to the next story, the next crisis, the next fleeting moment of collective focus. But the legislation would remain, and the foundation would continue, and the work would get done by people who cared more about results than recognition. Elena found him as the crowd dispersed. "You're heading back to Denver tonight?" "Early flight tomorrow. Amara has school Monday." "Will we see you for Christmas?" "Wouldn't miss it. She's already making decorations." They hugged, brief and tight. Then Elena pulled back, held him at arm's length, studied his face the way she'd done 100 times over 6 years, checking to make sure he was really okay, not just performing okayness. "You know what Marcus would say about all this?" "What?" "That the sky doesn't measure you by how high you fly. It measures you by how many people you lift up with you." The quote hit something deep. Darius blinked against sudden moisture in his eyes. That's exactly what he'd say. "So keep lifting, Rowan. That's how we honor him." The flight back to Denver was routine. Commercial airline, economy seat, no emergencies. Darius read a book while Amara colored in the workbook Mrs. Williams had given her. Just another pair of passengers among hundreds. Unremarkable to everyone, except the flight attendant who recognized him and upgraded them to Economy Plus without being asked. Landing at Denver International felt like closing a circle. 6 months ago, he'd departed from this airport as a maintenance worker nobody noticed. Today, he returned as the same person, but the world had adjusted its perception to acknowledge what had always been true. Competence existed independent of visibility. Worth preceded recognition. Heroism was just professionalism under pressure. Monday morning, Darius returned to work. Showed up at 6:30 in coveralls and steel-toed boots, ready to spend 8 hours inspecting aircraft systems and signing off on maintenance logs that most passengers would never know existed. His coworkers had stopped treating him differently after the first month. Initial awkwardness about working alongside someone famous had faded, and they remembered he was the same person he'd always been. Reliable, thorough, more interested in getting things right than getting credit. The work mattered. Every bolt he torqued, every system he tested, every component he certified as airworthy contributed to the invisible infrastructure that kept aviation safe. Pilots got recognition, but mechanics prevented disasters through the unglamorous accumulation of correctly completed tasks. A supervisor stopped by his workstation around 10. "Mitchell, got a call from corporate. They want to fly you to headquarters, talk about some kind of safety ambassador role." "What's the salary?" "Didn't say. Probably 6 figures, knowing corporate." "Tell them no thanks. I'm good here." The supervisor blinked. "You're turning down a promotion?" I'm turning down a desk job. I like fixing planes. Your call, man. Your call. The supervisor left, shaking his head. Darius returned his attention to the hydraulic system he was inspecting, checking pressure readings against specifications that existed because engineers had calculated exactly how much force was needed to keep control surfaces responsive under maximum load. Lunchtime brought the usual crowd to the break room. Sandwiches from home, vending machine snacks, conversations about weekend plans and upcoming holidays. Darius sat with 3 other mechanics, discussing a problem with landing gear doors on the 737 fleet. Someone had noticed a pattern of wear that shouldn't exist with proper lubrication. They debated causes, compared notes from different aircraft, decided to flag it for engineering review. This was the work that mattered, the vigilance that caught small problems before they became catastrophic ones. Marcus would have loved this conversation. The collaborative troubleshooting, the shared expertise, the commitment to getting it right even when getting it right meant extra paperwork and delays. 6 months had passed since Flight 447. Victoria Hale counted days in a federal prison, her empire reduced to a 6x8 cell and debts that would follow her for decades. Darius Mitchell worked his shift, picked up Amara from school, made dinner in an apartment he had no intention of leaving because square footage didn't determine whether a place felt like home. The contrast was absolute. But Darius didn't think about Victoria anymore. She'd become irrelevant the moment consequences arrived. His attention stayed focused on what mattered: daughter, work, community, the quiet accumulation of days lived according to principles that didn't require an audience to have meaning. Evening found him at the community college, teaching a class about hydraulic systems to 15 students who'd chosen aviation mechanics as a career path. He explained the cascade failures that could occur when primary systems lost pressure, drew diagrams showing backup configurations, emphasized that understanding why systems failed was as important as knowing how they worked. A student raised her hand. Mr. Mitchell, when you landed Flight 447, you were working with almost zero hydraulic pressure. How did you maintain control? The class went quiet. They all knew the story, but hearing it from him directly held different weight than reading news articles. I stopped trying to make the systems do what they couldn't do. Instead, I worked with what remained: airflow, momentum, basic physics. The plane wanted to fly. I just had to guide it in the right direction using whatever authority existed. But how did you stay calm? Darius set down the marker he'd been using on the whiteboard, turned to face the class fully. Fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you focus harder on the task. Every pilot feels fear. The ones who succeed are the ones who turn fear into fuel for concentration, rather than letting it freeze them. The student nodded slowly. Others leaned forward, absorbing the lesson that went beyond hydraulic systems into the territory of mental discipline and emotional control. One more thing, Darius added. I didn't save that plane alone. The captain trusted a stranger with 200 lives. The first officer followed instructions he'd never trained for. Flight attendants kept passengers calm in chaos. Everyone contributed. Heroism is almost always a team effort disguised as an individual achievement. Class ended at 8:30. Students filed out carrying notebooks and questions, and the beginning understanding that expertise was built through repetition and attention to detail across thousands of unglamorous hours. Darius locked up the classroom and walked to his Civic. 251,000 miles and counting. The check engine light had come on last week. He diagnosed the problem: oxygen sensor, easy fix, and ordered the part online for $23. Would install it himself this weekend because paying someone else to do work you could do yourself felt wasteful when budgets were tight and skills were available. Home by 9, Amara already asleep, Mrs. Williams dozing on the couch with the television playing quietly. She woke when he entered, gathered her things, declined his offer to walk her next door because it was 15 feet, and she'd been navigating that distance for 40 years. Darius checked on Amara, breathing steady, clutching her stuffed animal, the picture of peace that children radiated when they felt safe. He stood in her doorway for a moment, grateful for this specific life with this specific daughter in this specific moment that 6 months ago could have ended very differently. The living room welcomed him with familiar furniture and accumulated memories. He made tea, sat on the couch that had cost $200 used, and pulled out his phone. One new message from Karen Hayes. "Mr. Mitchell, Emma wanted me to send you this." Attached was a photo. Emma holding a certificate from her school, Student of the Month, awarded for outstanding courage and kindness. She was grinning gap-toothed at the camera, prouder than any 8-year-old had a right to be. The message continued. She told her teacher that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs doing anyway. Said she learned that from the pilot who saved her.
Thought you'd want to know. You're still making a difference in her life. Darius stared at the photo until his vision blurred, wiped his eyes, typed a response. "Tell Emma congratulations, and that she taught me something too. Sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back." He sent the message and sat in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the modest evidence of a life built on purpose rather than profit. Outside, planes took off from Denver International every few minutes, carrying passengers who trusted that thousands of invisible people had done their jobs correctly. Inside, a man who'd briefly been famous and chosen obscurity sat drinking tea and thinking about a little girl who'd learned courage from watching someone stay calm when calm was the hardest thing to maintain. 6 months had changed everything. Victoria Hale lost an empire. Darius Mitchell gained nothing except the certainty that he'd already had everything that mattered. Work that served others, a daughter who felt safe, friends who showed up, and the knowledge that when the moment came, he'd been ready. The universe didn't always enforce justice, but when it did, the ledgers balanced with mathematical precision. Some people flew in first class. Others owned nothing except their competence and their character. And when the plane failed, when systems collapsed, when 204 lives hung in the balance, the man in the worn hoodie turned out to be exactly what the moment required. Not because he was special, because he'd spent years preparing for a crisis he hoped would never come, building skills he might never use, learning lessons from a dead friend who'd understood that altitude didn't measure worth. Darius finished his tea, set the cup in the sink, and went to bed in the same apartment he'd wake up in tomorrow. Still a mechanic. Still a father. Still the kind of person who did what needed doing without requiring applause. The sky remembered everyone who'd ever flown through it, but it measured them not by how high they climbed or how much they earned. It measured them by whether they lifted others up on their way through, by whether their passage made the journey safer for everyone who followed. By that measure, Marcus Washington had been a giant, and Darius Mitchell was doing just fine.